Everywhere in the Old Testament, when God has spoken, his power is always elevated. He can do everything, we can do nothing. But here, there's someone with God who has the same sort of power to allot, to apportion, to decide, to allocate. Very strange. Because he poured out his life under death. That's not a sudden death like getting run over or shot. Poured out. You know, crucifixion is not death. Crucifixion is unto death. Quite different. And he was numbered with the transgressors. That doesn't just mean with the sinners, it means people counted criminals. He is counted a criminal, put in the middle to show he was the worst. For he bore the sin of many, the world, and made intercession for the transgressors. Until you get to the last 3 verses, he does nothing but suffer. Very amazing character, this one. The only thing he's known for in most of this story is suffering. He's not known for as a teacher, a philanthropist, an example. He's only known for suffering. And he doesn't do anything but suffer. There's no reference to a single act that he does until he dies. And then after he dies, he does a lot of things. The pleasure of the Lord prospers in his hand. He sees his offspring. He makes his death a guilt offering for the sins of the world. There is no literature like this, ancient or modern. And as mentioned before, this is a petty dialect, dead for 2,000 years. Only scholars read Hebrew. Given to a herd of captives. Nobodies. Perhaps I shouldn't say nobodies. They were the only people on earth that had a conscience. They didn't always live by it. The Jews were notorious for violating conscience, but they were the only tribe on earth with a conscience, because they had a law, a very strange law, a law that said if you want to be right with people, you've got to be right with your maker. A law that said living is loving. If you're not loving, you're not living. A law of 10 commandments about love. Very unusual law. A law that even dealt with your thoughts. The last of the 10 commandments was about thinking. No government can legislate thinking. Even the Russians couldn't do that. But here's a law that legislated thinking. Thou shalt not covet. Thou shalt not think wrongly. So the people who first received this parchment were people with a law and therefore with a conscience and therefore with an awareness of guilt. And to know that you're judgment bound and to realise that you're very mortal, that any day, any hour could be your last, and to be guilty, it's rather hard to handle. As mentioned earlier, pain is a predominant theme here. But you know, most of the pain of the world isn't primarily for the very guilty. Most of the pain of the world is vicarious. In a family, one or more members can suffer because of one other member. That's vicarious suffering. In a government of a country, the people can suffer vicariously because of their leaders. American people are being asked to pay between $2,000 and $3,000 each because of the greed of businessmen who, when they leave their positions, receive a gift of something like $100 million and walk off to the bank singing, passing the poor on the way. Most of the suffering of the world is vicarious. Most of the pain is not experienced by the very guilty. You know, Stalin lasted into his 70s, though people from Georgia very often lasted into their 80s. But he got into his 70s, and the days of our years are 70. And even Adolf Hitler, responsible for 50 million deaths, he got into his mid-50s. So most of the pain of the world is vicarious. We suffer much because of the sins of other people. Maybe a son or a daughter, maybe a spouse, maybe our government, maybe our church. But most pain is vicarious. But the difference in this story is that this man voluntarily assumes it. And that's the last thing I would ever want to do. I flee from pain, not to it. But this man voluntarily, vicariously suffers. Come back again, please, to the beginning of the passage. Here's a mass of contradictions indeed. Here's a servant, someone that's doing the bidding of another, who's going to be raised, lifted up, highly exalted. And having said that, then it talks about his humiliation. They don't go together. Not usually. Not usually. Royalty in England's known a lot of humiliation because the kids haven't always been right. But usually exaltation doesn't go with humiliation, but here it does. My servant will be raised, lifted up, highly exalted, and yet many are appalled at him. His appearance was so disfigured, his form marred. You've got to remember the man it's speaking about was flogged more than once. He was played with by the Roman soldiers who spat upon him and smote him. And he was crucified. So he'll be exalted, and yet he'll be humiliated. He'll sprinkle many nations. This is language that's priestly. The Jewish priest on the Day of Atonement took the blood of the sacrifice into the most holy place and sprinkled it on the mercy seat over the law. Very significant. There's the law that I've broken, but there's a mercy seat to give me hope. And here's the blood that represents my blood, atoning because I've broken that law. Sprinkling blood. There was another time when the priest would sprinkle. When people were defiled ceremonially, he would take special water and sprinkle the water. So the term sprinkling has to do with atonement and cleansing. And here's a man who could do it for nations. How do you do that? He'll sprinkle as a priest many nations. How can that be? Kings will shut their mouths because of him. What they are not told, they'll see, and what they've not heard, they'll understand. The message about this man is to go everywhere. It's not going to be confined to this herd of slaves. It's going to go to nations. It's going to go to royalty. It's going to go to kings and queens, prime ministers and governors. And many of them will be so astonished at what they hear. But the original people who hear it don't believe it. Chapter 53, verse 1. Who has believed our message? You know, the New Testament says, he came unto his own, and his own received him not. Neither did his own brethren believe in him. Who hath believed our report? So originally, the story about this man would not be believed. Here's his strange origin, root out of dry ground.